Of these strikes?
They're very much a continuation of what we've seen over the years, and not really just over the years, really over the centuries. You could go back probably since Napoleon came into the Middle East, and then the British were here for 150 years or so, that the Western powers have consistently used military force as their main instrument of political engagement in this region. And the situation now in Syria in particular is far more difficult for all these Western powers. I mean, it was ironic that it was the British, the French, and the Americans who combined on these strikes, because collectively those three countries over the last 100 years or so are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and injuries. But it was difficult for them in Syria now because you have Syria, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah forming quite a united front, and many other popular forces in the region around them pushing back. So there were very great limits on what the military strikes could do now, but the Western powers could do nothing else but do military strikes. So it really is an entertainment process rather than a political process.
The US, France and Britain have made it clear that these strikes were an attempt to punish and deter any further use of chemical weapons. Do you think they'll work?
Probably not. For a while they'll work. This is the pattern over the last 15, 20 years, 30 years with Iraq, with Sudan, with other countries in the region that the Western powers have bombed. They'll work for a while and then things will get back to normal. People in the region will say, look, chemical weapons are terrible, but tens of thousands of people dying in Yemen because of British and American-supported Saudi attacks are far worse. So this is the equation that the West has to deal with, that it is correct to stop the use of chemical weapons. Absolutely. Nobody wants chemical weapons used. But chemical weapons are atrocious as they are. They're a relatively minor factor compared to the hundreds of thousands of deaths that have been created by Arab governments, Israelis, and Western powers. And that's the balance that is constantly defining this region. And that's how popular opinion reacts. And some governments, increasingly now you've got like I said, Iran, Russia, Syria, and Hezbollah forming quite a united front, and it's very difficult to take military action in that context without sparking a bigger war, and nobody wants a bigger war, clearly.
So is your assessment really that these strikes were an attempt to do something for the sake of being seen to do something?
I think so. They're really more related to Western public opinion than to actually changing things on the ground. If you want to change things on the ground, you have to be involved in a serious political process and seriously addressing the underlying causes of conflicts in this region, which are political, economic, and social, and now increasingly environmental. And there's no sign of any serious engagement by Western powers, or the Russians, or the Iranians for that matter, or any of these external powers that are militarily engaged in the region, including the Turks now. There's no sign that any of them are looking at these underlying factors. So they're really jockeying for position using military force and local proxies on the ground who are also using military force. So this is a really tragic situation in the region, but it's the culmination of 200 years of foreign military intervention and 100 years of Arab autocracy and 55, 60 years of Arab-Israeli conflict, all of them coming together, and this is what it leads to.
Iran has warned of regional consequences following these strikes. Do you think there will be any? Is that just rhetoric?
It's rhetoric to a large extent, but the Iranians don't act according to what CNN and Fox News wants. They act according to what they believe will serve their interests in the region. They act on the ground quietly through proxy forces and strategic allies, which they are developing all over the region. So they will react in some form, but not necessarily through explicit military action in the way that the Western powers have done now. But what you can see in the last 20 years or so is Iranian influence increasing vastly all across the Arab region, while American influence has decreased, and the Americans are left basically only with their military capabilities, which have increasingly less and less impact.
Just seeing pictures of President Assad arriving for work, in inverted commas, clearly attempting to show that everything is as normal in the Syrian capital, Damascus, today. Will it have any impact, these airstrikes, on his standing, his support, do you think?
Not really. Assad's support is clear. A lot of people in Syria like him. A lot of more probably people dislike him. There's been a massive civilian uprising against him over the last 7 years. He is clearly not the president that is supported by all Syrians, but these strikes won't change his standing or his actions, I don't believe.
Okay.
Especially if
Apologies. Really good to talk to you, Rami. Khouri, thanks very much for your analysis and for joining us from Beirut. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Eric,